Every detail matters. Every clue can change everything. Nolan's own best friend just sat down for the most detailed interview anyone connected to this case has given yet, and then he did something nobody else in the story has done. He physically walked back to the dock where Nolan left that morning and out to Horn Island itself to show you exactly what that day looked like. This is one person's account, given in his own words, on camera, standing in the exact locations he's describing, a detailed first-hand version of events from someone who was there, not an independently confirmed timeline. Let's get into it. The first thing worth clearing up is what caused the panic on that boat before Nolan even comes into the story. According to this friend, a girl ran up to tell him his own younger brother had just gotten into a fight on the beach. He sprinted over, found his brother had been punched and had put the other guy in an armbar and pulled him away from the situation. He was direct and specific on one point. Nolan was nowhere near that fight. That detail matters because a version of this altercation has circulated online for weeks, tangled up with questions about whether Nolan himself was involved in some kind of physical confrontation that day. Nolan wasn't present for any of it. Now, the number that I think reshapes how a lot of people have pictured this entire day. For weeks, the public version of this story has been built around a simple image: 4 friends taking Nolan out to a remote island and coming back without him. This friend says that image is flatly wrong. He says the group that traveled out to Horn Island that day wasn't 4 people on one boat. It was upwards of 20 people, spread across 3 separate boats. He walked the actual dock where they'd left from that morning, standing at the same angle as footage he says exists from that day, specifically to show how many people were loading onto boats at once. His point was direct. Several of the people who've been publicly scrutinized in connection with Nolan's disappearance weren't even on the same boat as him that day. He then took the same trip out to Horn Island itself, walking the shoreline near where the group had been anchored. Standing there, he described the scene in a way that I think is worth sitting with for a second. It was, in his telling, a packed holiday scene, boat after boat, group after group, all celebrating the 4th of July in the same general area, nothing like a quiet, secluded stretch of coastline where a small group could slip away from a friend unnoticed. He estimated as many as 2,000 people were on that stretch of beach that day. Boats lined up 2, 3, 4 deep, stretching down the island as far as he could see. A crowded beach doesn't automatically mean nothing could have happened to Nolan. And it doesn't resolve any of the specific contradictions this case has raised about who said what to whom in his final hours, but it does push back directly on one particular version of this story. The idea that Nolan was isolated with only a small handful of people the entire day, with no one else around to have seen or heard anything. If this friend's account of the crowd size is accurate, there were, by his estimate, thousands of potential witnesses on that same stretch of coastline, which raises its own question this series has asked before: why so few of them appear to have come forward with anything concrete? Now, the actual moment everyone's been arguing about for weeks, the last confirmed sighting, and the request to get on the boat. This friend described the boat's mechanical failure directly, standing at the dock. The bilge pump, the device that pumps water out of the boat as it comes in, had stopped working. When he opened the back hatch, water had risen high enough to reach the batteries, with more creeping toward the transom near the motor itself. In his words, they were in an emergency, trying to save the boat itself rather than simply deciding to leave on a whim. He said Wyatt called out to Nolan directly, telling him to get on the boat more than once, and that Nolan chose, as an adult making his own decision, to stay behind with the girl he'd been spending the day with. That girl, he said, is herself a witness to that same exchange. Here's a detail from this same conversation that deserves real scrutiny, because it's a specific, checkable detail rather than a general impression. He said that after the boys left the island around 4:30, there was a separate report of someone seeing Nolan again around 6:30 that evening. If true, that would be significant. Every timeline this case has operated on so far treats 4:30 as close to the end of the confirmed window, the point after which Nolan's whereabouts become an open question. A credible sighting 2 hours later would mean Nolan was alive and visibly present on that island for considerably longer than the timeline most reporting has assumed. This friend didn't say who made that report or how it reached him, only that he'd heard it. That's exactly the kind of detail that needs a name and a source before it can be treated as established, and right now it isn't one. He also walked through the geography of the island itself in a way that adds real texture to how dangerous that water is. Standing in the shallows, he described how quickly the bottom drops away from waist-deep water to neck-deep within a short distance and then down to somewhere between 17 and 20 feet. He said that when they were leaving that evening, the water beneath their own boat, less than a quarter mile off the island, was already around 30 feet deep. He also pointed specifically to the western tip of the island as the spot where the current turns genuinely dangerous. None of that tells us what happened to Nolan specifically. It does tell you that this wasn't a gentle, forgiving stretch of coastline, and that the ordinary risks of that water were real for anyone in it that day, regardless of anything else going on. This friend explained twice in two separate conversations a detail that reframes something this case has treated as suspicious for weeks: the question of Nolan's phone. He said leaving your phone on the boat is close to universal practice at Horn Island. People go out there specifically to get away from their phones. The water is often too murky and choppy to risk carrying one. And if someone does bring a phone into the water briefly for a photo, it goes right back on the boat afterward. Standing on the boat itself, he described the console covered in phones that day, so many that some belonged to people nobody on board could immediately identify, with more than 20 people spread across 3 boats, he said. Of course, every single phone ended up sitting on a console somewhere rather than in the water. He said plainly that in his entire life visiting that island, he's never once seen anyone standing waist deep in the water scrolling on a phone. By his account, Nolan's phones staying behind on the boat matched what everyone else on that trip was already doing with theirs. Here's the detail I think moves the central contradiction in this case forward the most. According to this friend, Katie herself texted him directly the next day before Nolan's body had even been found, describing that same moment on the beach. He said she wrote that the last time she saw Nolan was exactly when Wyatt was calling for him to get on the boat, and that Nolan chose not to. If that message is real and he says he has it saved, it would mean Katie's own account from the day after Nolan disappeared actually lines up with the friend group's version rather than contradicting it, which is different from how her family's later secondhand statements have generally been read publicly. It's a specific falsifiable detail, not a vague impression. Exactly the kind of thing investigators should be able to confirm or rule out directly with Katie herself. He also gave an actual accounting of his own night, hour by hour. After getting back to shore, the group went to a friend's house for a 4th of July gathering with fireworks. He mentioned a small but telling detail about that stop, that he spent a chunk of that evening upstairs talking to the host's father about boats, while the rest of his friends were downstairs by the pool. That's part of why he says he wasn't watching the clock closely at first. He simply assumed Nolan was somewhere in the mix with everyone else. It was only after coming back downstairs, rejoining the group, and asking Wyatt directly where Nolan was, that anyone realized nobody had heard from him. He texted Javon and a few others who'd also been on the island asking if anyone had heard from him. When nobody had, he asked Javon for Nolan's mother's phone number, reached her by phone, and told her plainly that if she hadn't heard from her son, he was calling the Coast Guard. That call happened around 11 that night, the same 11 o'clock call we've covered in earlier updates, except now, for the first time, we have the actual person who made it describing his own reasoning in his own words. He said he'd rather call the Coast Guard 100 times and be wrong than not call once and be right. It's a decision he framed as coming directly from a lifetime spent around that same water, knowing exactly how quickly things can turn out there. The next morning brought its own detail worth including. He woke up around 7:30 to a text from his own father, who'd already seen Nolan's photo circulating on Facebook. Shortly after, his stepdad came into his room asking what he'd heard, then told him they were taking the boat back out to help look. When he got out on the water that morning, he described the scale of the search as something far beyond a few friends checking nearby coves. Dozens of Mississippi Department of Marine Resources boats, helicopters, and planes were working the area, extending beyond Horn Island to Ship Island, Chandeleur Island, and Petit Pois as well. He learned that Nolan's body had been found the following day while driving with a friend named Brooks when another friend called him directly with the news. He said he'd been trying to hold on to hope up to that point, but that hope was hard to sustain by the second full day without word. In his own words, he broke down in the car. He later described crying on Brooks's shoulder, saying it was one of the hardest things he'd personally experienced, the kind of moment where he can still recall exactly where he was standing when the call came in. He also addressed the pool photo directly, the one that spread online as supposed proof Nolan had been seen alive at a party after the boat trip. He confirmed what's already been separately verified through metadata, that the photo was taken June 27th, a full week before Independence Day, at a different friend's house in Pass Christian. He added a detail that hadn't been public before, that he's actually in that same photo himself, his arm around Nolan's shoulder, which is part of how he's able to say with total confidence exactly when and where it was taken. Asked directly whether he believes race played any role in what happened that day, he said no, and pointed to years of the friend group's own social media history posting alongside Nolan going back to freshman year of high school as evidence that this wasn't some group Nolan felt out of place in. That's his own account of his own friendships, one perspective on a question this case has raised on far more grounds than just one friend's personal read on the relationship. Nothing in this interview is independently new evidence in the way the GPS data or the autopsy findings were. It's one person's detailed, specific account, walked through twice, once in conversation and once standing in the actual locations he's describing, and its value depends entirely on whether it holds up against everything else investigators are able to verify. The 6:30 sighting and Katie's text message are the two details here that matter most, and they're also the two that remain entirely unconfirmed by anyone outside this friend himself. But this is, without question, the most granular first-hand version of that afternoon anyone connected to this case has given publicly. And it directly addresses several of the specific contradictions this series has spent weeks unpacking: the fight, the phone, the crowd size, the last sighting, and the pool photo, all in one telling. I want to know what you think about that 6:30 sighting specifically. If someone genuinely saw Nolan 2 hours after his friends left the island, why hasn't that person come forward publicly themselves? Tell me in the comments what you think that would mean for this timeline. We'll keep bringing you every piece of this as it develops. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Monsters don't exist, but people capable of monstrous things do.